In the summer of 1903, if you walked the boardwalk at Coney Island, past the fortune tellers and the sword swallowers, past the bearded lady and the human cannonball, past the carousel and the funhouse mirrors, you would eventually arrive at a small building with a sign above the door that read, "Infant Incubators with Living Infants. Admission, 25 cents. Inside, in rows of glass and steel boxes kept at a precise temperature, connected to filtered air supplies, tended by trained nurses in starched uniforms, lay the smallest human beings you had ever seen. Some weighed less than 2 pounds. Some were so translucent you could see the blood moving beneath their skin. They were alive. They were being kept alive by a technology that the hospitals of New York City had refused to use. The man responsible for this was not a carnival huckster. He was not a fraud. He was a physician named Martin Arthur Couney, and for nearly half a century, he ran premature infant exhibitions at fairs and amusement parks across the United States and Europe, charging the public to view babies fighting for their lives, and using the admission money to provide, free of charge, the most advanced neonatal care in the world. He saved approximately 6,500 lives. The medical establishment, for most of his career, pretended he did not exist. To understand how a doctor ended up displaying infants at a freak show, you have to understand what medicine believed about premature babies in 1900. It believed, with the serene confidence of institutional authority, that there was nothing to be done. A baby born significantly early, what the medical literature of the era called a weakling, was expected to die. The standard of care in most American and European hospitals was to wrap the infant in cotton wool, place it near a warm stove, and wait. If the baby died, which it almost certainly would, the death was recorded as natural and inevitable. If it somehow survived, this was considered a miracle rather than a medical outcome. The idea that a premature infant might be saved through systematic intervention, through controlled temperature, filtered air, specialized feeding, careful nursing, was not merely unpracticed. It was considered by much of the profession to be a misguided waste of resources on organisms whose survival was not worth pursuing. This was not a fringe position. It was the mainstream. When a Parisian obstetrician named Stéphane Tarnier introduced the first hospital incubator in 1880, based with elegant irony on the warming boxes used at the Paris Zoo to hatch chicken eggs, and demonstrated that it dramatically increased the survival rate of premature infants at the Maternité Hospital, his colleagues' response was largely indifferent. The technology existed. The evidence existed. The medical establishment declined to act on it. Enter a Berliner named Alexandre Lyon, who in 1896 displayed premature infants in his incubators at the Berlin World Exposition. The public was transfixed. The medical community was appalled. Martin Couney, then a young physician who had trained under the great obstetricians of Paris and Berlin, attended Lyon's exhibition and understood immediately what he was seeing. Not a spectacle, but a demonstration. Not exploitation, but proof. Couney took the idea, refined it, and spent the next 50 years proving that the medicine of his time was wrong. His method was, by any measure, extraordinary. Couney's incubators were not the crude devices hospitals occasionally used and mostly ignored. They were engineered instruments, double-walled steel cabinets maintained at precisely 98 degrees Fahrenheit by a water heating system, ventilated with air filtered through a series of gauze layers and antiseptic solutions, monitored continuously by trained nursing staff. The nurses Couney employed were graduates of formal nursing programs, and he paid them well. The physician overseeing medical care was credentialed and present. The feeding protocols were meticulous. Premature infants were fed breast milk, which Couney obtained by paying wet nurses, understanding decades before the research confirmed it that human milk was superior to formula for fragile newborns. The mortality rate among infants who entered Cooney's exhibitions was approximately 28%, meaning roughly 72% of the babies he cared for survived. The mortality rate for premature infants in hospitals of the same era was, in many institutions, above 80%. Cooney was not just doing better than the hospitals. He was doing categorically, incomparably better, by a margin so large it should have ended the debate immediately. It did not, because the debate was not really about the data. It was about where the babies were. The same medical establishment that had declined to adopt incubator technology in its hospitals was deeply uncomfortable with the fact that a colleague had taken that technology to Coney Island and placed it between the carousel and the sideshow. The discomfort was aesthetic, moral, and territorial. These were human infants, not exhibits. A freak show was no place for medicine. The proper setting for medical care was a hospital, even if, in that proper setting, the babies died. The irony was exquisite, and the logic was merciless. The hospitals would not use the technology. The hospitals would not fund a dedicated facility to use the technology. The hospitals would not permit Cooney to operate within their walls. And then the hospitals condemned him for operating outside them. Cooney's relationship with the families was unlike anything the hospitals offered. When a premature baby was born, in a tenement apartment, in a charity ward, in a suburban home, and the attending physician declared the case hopeless, someone might mention Cooney's exhibition. The family, having been told their child would die, would appear at his door. Cooney never charged them, not 1 cent ever from any family whose baby he cared for. The admission fees paid by the curious public covered everything: the equipment, the nurses, the wet nurses, the physicians, the feeding, the weeks or months of round-the-clock care that a premature infant required. The parents could visit any time. They could watch through the glass as their child was fed, turned, examined, coaxed toward viability. In an era when hospitals routinely separated patients from their families, when a mother delivering in a maternity ward might not see her infant for days, Cooney insisted on presence. The parents knew their baby. The nurses knew the parents. The relationship between the exhibition and the families it served was one of the few genuinely humane features of neonatal care in America for the first half of the 20th century. Among the children Cooney saved was a girl named Lucille Horn, born in 1920 at 2 pounds 3 ounces. She lived to be 96. She spoke at Cooney's retrospective exhibition at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, the same fair where, in a moment of supreme historical irony, the mainstream medical establishment finally began publicly acknowledging what Cooney had been demonstrating for 4 decades. There is a question that runs beneath the entire story of Martin Couney, and it is uncomfortable in a way that reaches beyond medicine. Why did the institutions resist? The evidence was available from the 1880s. Tarnier's results at the maternité were published and discussed. Cooney's survival rates were known and documentable. But technology was not expensive, not experimental, not dangerous. The barrier was not knowledge, not funding, not technical capacity. The barrier was institutional inertia, the vast, slow, self-perpetuating weight of what was already believed, already practiced, already invested with professional authority. Medical institutions, like all institutions, are conservative by nature. This conservatism has genuine value. It protects patients from fads, from untested interventions, from the enthusiasms of individual practitioners. But it also has a cost, and the cost is paid in specific human lives that the institution declines to examine too closely. The premature infants who died in American hospitals between 1890 and 1940 while functional incubator technology sat at Coney Island are not remembered. They were never counted. Their deaths were recorded as natural, inevitable, expected. the outcome of a condition that medicine had decided was beyond its jurisdiction. This is how institutional indifference protects itself, not through active malice, but through the designation of certain problems as unsolvable, not through cruelty, but through the prior determination of who counts as a viable patient. Cooney challenged this, not with argument, but with evidence, and then went on challenging it for 50 years while the institutions continued to look away. He never received a formal appointment at an American hospital. He was never granted the academic recognition that his outcomes deserved. He died in 1950, 3 years after the last of his Coney Island exhibitions closed, having outlived his usefulness to an establishment that had finally, quietly, adopted the practices he had pioneered, without acknowledging where it had learned them. The parallel story here, the one that connects Cooney to the other themes of standardization and loss, is about what happens when knowledge exists outside of sanctioned institutions. Cooney's incubators worked. The knowledge was real. The outcomes were documented. But because the knowledge was held in a carnival booth rather than a hospital ward, it could be ignored, dismissed, condescended to, not on its merits, but on its address. The location contaminated the data. The spectacle discredited the science. This is a pattern that appears wherever institutional authority and empirical reality come into conflict. The cathedral decides what frequencies are correct, and the local instrument builders are irrelevant. The railroad decides what time it is, and the village sundial is quaint. The agricultural industry decides which seeds are viable, and the land-race farmer is backward. The hospital decides which patients are worth treating, and the man at the carnival with the 72% survival rate is an embarrassment. In each case, the institution's authority is exercised not through superior outcomes, but through superior legitimacy. The standard is the standard not because it is best, but because it has been standardized. And the cost? The 6,500 survivors at Coney Island, the 10,000 apple varieties, the 40 minutes of circadian misalignment, is paid quietly by people who never knew what they were losing, because the institution that should have told them had decided there was nothing to discuss. There is one more thing to know about Martin Couney. He is believed to have fabricated parts of his biography, his credentials, his lineage, his relationship to the great European physicians whose authority he invoked. The records are inconsistent. The details do not always check out. Historians who have examined his life closely suggest that Martin Couney may have been a constructed identity, that the precise nature and extent of his medical training remains uncertain. It does not change a single one of the 6,500 outcomes. The babies were real. The incubators worked. The nurses were trained. The survival rates are documented. Whatever the man's name was, wherever he actually came from, whatever credentials he actually held, he built the thing that worked, ran it for half a century at his own financial risk, charged wealthy visitors to fund the care of families who could not afford it, and spent his life proving that the most prestigious medical institutions in America were choosing to let babies die for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. You can question his biography. You cannot question his results. And perhaps there is something appropriate about that. The idea that the person who finally forced the confrontation between institutional authority and human life was someone who operated entirely outside the institution's systems of legitimacy. Someone who had to build his proof not in a hospital, but in a sideshow. Someone who had to sell tickets to the public because the public, unlike the profession, was willing to look at the evidence and draw the obvious conclusion. The babies breathed in the glass boxes on the Coney Island boardwalk. The sword swallowers performed 50 feet away. The carousel turned. The 25-cent admission bought you one of the most important medical demonstrations of the 20th century. And the hospitals across the city continued doing what they had always done.